Abraham lived peacefully in his land, surrounded by his family, wealth, and prosperity. Yet, deep within his heart, he felt an emptiness. He and his wife, Sarah, were old, and despite the blessings they had received, they had no children. The promise God had made to Abraham to give him a great nation seemed distant and almost impossible. They had many gifts, but no descendants to carry on the legacy. One morning, as Abraham rested in his tent, a powerful voice resonated from the heavens. "Abraham, take your son, your only son Isaac, and go to a distant land. There, sacrifice him as an offering to me. Don't forget to like and share with your friends. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any exciting stories, and turn on the bell to receive notifications firsthand. We want to hear your opinion. Comment below on what you think of this video and share your thoughts with us. Let's be part of this journey of faith and learning together." Abraham's heart was overwhelmed with grief. How could God ask for such a sacrifice? Isaac, the promised son, the one he had waited for so long, was to be offered. There were so many questions swirling in his mind. Yet, despite the deep pain that gripped him, Abraham knew that God's will must be fulfilled, even if he did not fully understand the reasons behind it. Without hesitation, Abraham began to prepare for the journey. He took the fire, the wood, and everything necessary for the sacrifice, but deep in his heart, he couldn't fully comprehend what was about to unfold. The journey would be long and arduous, but Abraham did not stray from God's command. Isaac, his son, did not fully understand the gravity of their mission. He walked alongside his father, innocently asking, "Father, we have the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the offering?" Abraham looked at him and responded with a quiet certainty, "God will provide the lamb, my son." These words were a promise of faith, but they also concealed the turmoil within Abraham's heart. In that moment, Abraham understood that the sacrifice was not merely about offering a lamb, but about trusting in God's provision even when the path was unclear. It was about following God's will even when it seemed incomprehensible. As they neared the sacred mountain, the weight of what Abraham was about to do became heavier. What would happen there? How would he fulfill this test of faith? But despite the questions, Abraham knew that the only way forward was through trust in God's plan. Abraham and Isaac continued their journey, the silence between them growing heavier with each step. The road to Mount Moriah seemed endless, and each footfall weighed on Abraham's heart. Although he had received God's command, the pain of what he was about to do was almost too much to bear. The promise of a great nation, the hope of Isaac's future, all seemed in jeopardy as he climbed higher toward the mount where he would be asked to make the ultimate sacrifice. Abraham's thoughts were consumed with the test ahead. Why had God asked him to do this? How could he offer his beloved son as a sacrifice? The questions kept coming, but Abraham's faith remained steadfast. He knew that trusting God, even without understanding, was the only path forward. Yet the burden of that trust was heavy on his soul. Isaac, on the other hand, was still innocent to the situation's full gravity. As they continued their journey, he looked to his father, curious but unaware. "Father, we have the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the offering?" Isaac asked with genuine concern. His question pierced Abraham's heart, but he responded with the same calm resolve. "God will provide the lamb, my son." Abraham's response was more than just reassurance to Isaac. It was a declaration of his own trust in God's provision. As much as Abraham struggled internally, he knew that he had to let God lead him through this dark and difficult path. The further they traveled, the heavier the journey seemed. Every step brought them closer to the place where Abraham would be tested like never before. But in his heart, Abraham knew one thing, that no matter what, his faith in God had to remain unshaken. His life had always been guided by God's promises, and now was the moment to fully trust in those promises, even when the path seemed unclear. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they arrived at the foot of Mount Moriah. Abraham saw the place that God had directed him to, and a wave of conflicting emotions rushed over him. His heart ached at the thought of what was to come, yet he knew that this was the moment that would define his faith. As they began preparing the altar, Abraham's mind raced through all the promises and lessons he had learned over the years. He had left his homeland in obedience to God, trusted God for a son when it seemed impossible, and now he had to trust him in the most painful way. Isaac stood beside him, unaware of the full scope of his father's sacrifice. In his innocence, he watched as Abraham gathered the wood and stones to build the altar. But Abraham, with each stone he placed, felt his own heart breaking, knowing that the sacrifice was not just physical, but spiritual. The man who had walked so many paths of faith now had to walk the hardest one of all, offering the thing he loved most for the God he trusted most. As the altar was built, the final step was almost upon them. The silence of the moment was deafening. Abraham turned to Isaac and, with a trembling voice, said, "My son, God has called me to this, and I must obey. Though my heart aches, I know that God's plan is greater than anything I can understand. Trust Him, for He will provide." As Abraham and Isaac approached the top of Mount Moriah, a deep, heavy silence fell between them. The preparations were nearly complete, and everything seemed to slow down, as if the very earth and sky were holding their breath. The altar stood ready, made from stones gathered by Abraham's hands. The wood lay neatly stacked, waiting for the fire. Abraham, though filled with love for his son, now had to face the truth of what he must do. Isaac, though still unaware of the full weight of the situation, had noticed the solemnity in his father's manner. His heart began to fill with unease. "Father," Isaac asked, his voice tentative, "where is the lamb for the sacrifice?" Abraham's heart wrenched at the question. How could he explain to his son that the lamb was not to come from God's provision, but from Isaac himself? How could he bear to reveal the truth that would shatter his son's innocence and trust? Abraham took a deep breath, his voice steady but filled with grief. "God will provide the lamb, my son," he replied, trying to hide the agony in his own heart. This answer, though filled with faith, was a mask for the torment Abraham felt deep within. How could God ask for such a sacrifice, especially after all he had promised? Abraham gently guided Isaac to the altar. With trembling hands, he bound his son and placed him on the altar, the weight of the moment unbearable. Isaac, still not fully understanding the depth of the situation, laid still. He trusted his father completely, believing in the love and wisdom Abraham had always shown him. Yet as Abraham prepared the fire, a heavy realization began to settle in his heart. As the fire was lit, the flames crackled, dancing and flickering in the still air. The heat of the fire began to rise, but it could not compare to the searing pain that pierced Abraham's soul. How could he, the father of this boy, whom he loved more than life itself, fulfill such a command? How could he sacrifice his son,
the one through whom God had promised to make him the father of nations. Abraham lifted the knife. His hands shook with the weight of the moment. His heart pounded in his chest, every beat filled with sorrow and confusion. He raised the knife, prepared to follow through. But as his arm began to descend, something happened. A voice, clear and powerful, called out to him, "Abraham, Abraham!" The voice was unmistakable. God's voice. Abraham froze, knife in hand, heart racing. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," came the command. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son."
A wave of relief and astonishment washed over Abraham. Tears welled in his eyes as he lowered the knife. He had been tested, and God had spared Isaac. But the lesson Abraham had learned was profound. It was not the sacrifice itself that mattered, but the surrender of his heart, his willingness to place his trust completely in God, no matter how difficult the command. Abraham looked around, and there, caught in a thicket by its horns, was a ram. God had provided the sacrifice, just as he had promised. Abraham, trembling but grateful, took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering in place of his son. Abraham's heart was flooded with a peace that transcended understanding. The promise was still intact, and Isaac was spared. God had not required Isaac's life, but had tested Abraham's faith to the utmost. Through this trial, Abraham's trust in God had been solidified, and he knew with certainty that God's plan would always come to pass, no matter what. After the sacrifice was completed, and the ram was offered in place of Isaac, Abraham stood quietly by the altar, his heart still racing, but now filled with gratitude. The weight of what had almost transpired hung heavily in the air, but in that moment, the silence felt different, peaceful, holy. God had provided, and Isaac's life had been spared. As Abraham and Isaac began their journey down the mountain, the tranquility of the moment was profound. Isaac, still reeling from the experience, didn't fully understand the depth of the test his father had gone through. But he knew one thing for sure. His father's faith in God was unwavering, and that faith had saved his life. The bond between father and son had been forever changed, deepened by the shared experience of faith, sacrifice, and divine intervention. Abraham, although relieved, could not shake the overwhelming sense of awe he felt toward God. The trial had been the hardest thing he had ever faced, and yet, through it, he had learned something essential, that God's will, even when incomprehensible, was the path to true blessing and peace. As they continued their journey, Abraham couldn't help but reflect on the words God had spoken to him when he intervened. "Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son." Those words echoed in his mind, and with them came a realization that the test had not been for nothing. God had tested him, yes, but he had also shown Abraham a profound truth. Obedience and trust in God were the true keys to blessing. It was then that God spoke again, this time with a voice of renewed promise. "Because you have done this, and have not withheld from me your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed." These words were not new to Abraham. They were a reaffirmation of the promises God had made long ago. But now, with his faith tested to its limits, those promises felt deeper, more tangible. He had passed the test. Through his obedience, Abraham had shown that his trust in God was complete.
And in return, God reaffirmed his covenant with Abraham, not just for him, but for all the generations that would come after him. Abraham's heart swelled with gratitude and awe. He realized that God's promise was not just about the wealth or the future of his descendants, but about the deeper blessing that would come through faithfulness. The lineage of Abraham would be marked by trust in God's will, and through it, God's blessing would flow to all the nations of the earth. Isaac, now more mature and aware of the gravity of the events, walked beside his father, the bond between them stronger than ever. The lessons learned on Mount Moriah were ones that would stay with both of them for the rest of their lives. Isaac would carry forward the faith Abraham had modeled for him, and together they would continue to walk in the promise that had been passed down from God. With the promise of God firmly renewed and Isaac spared, Abraham continued his journey, now carrying a deep sense of fulfillment. The test had been hard, and the pain of nearly losing Isaac had scarred him. But through it, he had come to understand the nature of divine faithfulness on a level that transcended human understanding. His trust in God was no longer just an intellectual belief. It was a living, breathing reality that shaped every decision he made. As the years passed, Abraham settled into his later life with a profound sense of peace. He had witnessed the hand of God at work in his life, guiding him, protecting him, and fulfilling his promises step by step. His relationship with Isaac was now solid, bound not just by blood, but by a shared faith, one that would extend to future generations. But Abraham knew that while he had been blessed beyond measure, the true legacy of his life would not be measured in wealth or possessions. His true inheritance lay in the faith he had passed down and the promise God had made to him, to his son Isaac, and to all the generations that would follow. This was the inheritance Abraham cherished most deeply. The legacy of trusting in God's plan, even when that plan led him through difficult testing moments. One day, as Abraham sat with Isaac and the family gathered around, he called his son to his side. "Isaac," Abraham began, his voice full of wisdom, "God has promised us many things, but we must never forget that the greatest gift He gives is the gift of faith. You, my son, are the one to carry this promise forward. As God has been faithful to me, He will be faithful to you. The path ahead will not always be easy, but you must trust in Him. His ways are higher than our ways, and His timing is always perfect."
Isaac, now a man of maturity and wisdom himself, nodded thoughtfully. He understood that the faith his father had shown was not just a part of their family's past, but a living reality that had to be carried into the future. Isaac would continue the work Abraham had started, building upon the foundation of faith that had been laid so many years ago. Abraham's thoughts often turned to the future and to the descendants that would spring from Isaac. Though he had been promised that his offspring would become a great nation, Abraham had learned that God's promises were not always immediate or easily understood. Yet in his heart, he knew that his part in God's grand plan was to trust, to wait, and to pass on the legacy of faith. And so, Abraham continued to live out his days, not in the pursuit of personal gain, but in the hope that his descendants would honor the covenant made with him by God. He saw the continuation of the promise not just as a blessing for himself, but as a blessing for all the earth. Abraham understood that the legacy of faith was not meant to be hoarded or protected, but shared and passed on, so that through it all nations might be blessed. As the years came to a close for Abraham, his thoughts were peaceful. He had lived a full life, marked by moments of challenge, but also by moments of profound grace. He had seen his faith tested and refined, and in that testing, he had come to understand the full depth of God's love and provision. And when his time came, Abraham passed from this life with a heart full of gratitude, knowing that the promises God had made would continue to unfold through Isaac and his descendants. His legacy of faith would live on, passed from generation to generation, as a living testament to the faithfulness of God. Years passed, and Isaac, now a grown man, took on the mantle of leadership within the family. The promises God had made to his father Abraham were now his to carry forward, and the responsibility weighed heavily on his shoulders. Isaac had always looked up to his father as a model of faith, but now he had to navigate his own path of trust in God. God's promises to Abraham had been clear and resounding, and Isaac had been a direct beneficiary of them. But Isaac knew that to live out these promises, he too would be tested. Just as his father had faced moments of great difficulty, Isaac was beginning to realize that his own faith would be put to the test. It was during this time of reflection that Isaac faced a profound trial. A great famine struck the land, and the crops began to fail. People around him, struggling with the scarcity of food, began to leave the land in search of better opportunities elsewhere. Isaac found himself standing at a crossroads. Should he stay in the land that had been promised to his father, or should he leave in search of a more fertile land, just as many had done before him? As he pondered this decision, Isaac turned to God for guidance. He prayed, asking for direction, wondering if God would show him what he should do. In the quiet of his prayer, Isaac heard God's voice once more.
"Do not go down to Egypt," God commanded him. "Stay in the land I promised to your father. Live here, and I will be with you. I will bless you and give this land to you and your descendants. I will fulfill the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through them." Isaac, hearing God's words, knew he had to trust. It wasn't easy. Many around him were seeking better lands where they could find food and prosper. But Isaac understood that trusting in God's promises meant staying obedient to God's plan, even when the path ahead was uncertain. So Isaac chose to remain in the land, even though it meant facing the hardship of famine. He planted crops, trusting that God would provide. And indeed, as Isaac sowed the seeds in faith, God blessed him abundantly. The crops grew strong, and Isaac's prosperity began to return. His land flourished, and he became increasingly wealthy with many servants and great herds of livestock. However, Isaac's success did not go unnoticed. The people around him began to grow envious of his success, and soon the Philistines, who had once welcomed him, became resentful. They filled up the wells that Abraham had dug in the past, trying to block his access to water. The bitterness of jealousy and rivalry began to stir in the land. But instead of responding with anger and attempting to retaliate, Isaac chose the path of peace. Just as his father Abraham had done before him, Isaac decided to move on and avoid conflict. He went to another area where he dug new wells, trusting that God would provide for his needs. In time, God blessed Isaac's efforts, and he found a source of fresh water. Isaac's faith and obedience to God were tested once again, but this time his challenges came from his neighbors, the Philistines. After Isaac's prosperity grew, the Philistines, who had once welcomed him, became envious of his success. The land that had once seemed plentiful was now filled with jealousy, and the wells that Abraham had dug in earlier years were now being stopped up by the Philistines. Isaac, though he had learned from his father's example of peace and trust in God, chose to take a step back and avoid conflict.
The wells were vital to survival, and the act of filling them was both a sign of hostility and a challenge to Isaac's ability to provide for his people. But instead of responding in anger or resentment, Isaac calmly moved his camp and dug new wells. His servants worked hard, digging wells that would provide water for his livestock and family, and once again, God blessed their efforts.
The Philistines, however, did not stop. They found the new wells and argued over them, claiming the water as their own. Isaac could have fought for his rights, but instead he chose to move again. Each time he went a little further, digging new wells, and each time God provided for him. Finally, Isaac found a place where there was no dispute, and the well he dug was unchallenged. In that moment of peace, Isaac understood something profoundly important. God was teaching him the value of patience, humility, and persistence. God's promises were not always fulfilled in an instant, but through trust, perseverance, and obedience. Isaac didn't fight the Philistines. He trusted God to take care of him and to lead him to a place of peace. As Isaac settled into this new place, God appeared to him once again. In the quiet of the night, God spoke with words of comfort and affirmation. "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." Isaac, filled with peace, built an altar there and called on the name of the Lord. He knew that God had led him to this place of peace, and that it was God who had provided the land, the water, and the security. Isaac realized that his trust in God had been rewarded, not just through material blessings, but through the spiritual peace that only God could give. But the story did not end there. News of Isaac's success and peace reached King Abimelech, the ruler of the Philistines, who had once filled up Isaac's wells with dirt. Fearing that Isaac's prosperity and influence might continue to grow, Abimelech came to Isaac with his chief advisor and the commander of his forces. They arrived at Isaac's camp and said, "We see that the Lord is with you, and we want to make a treaty with you, a covenant. Let there be no conflict between us, just as there was no conflict between your father and ours. We have treated you well, and we want you to continue to be at peace with us." Isaac, who could have responded with bitterness or pride, instead accepted the offer of peace. "Why have you come to me since you were hostile to me and sent me away?" he asked. But the men from Abimelech replied, "We saw clearly that the Lord was with you, and we want to make a covenant that you will do us no harm, just as we have not harmed you." Isaac, understanding the importance of reconciliation, agreed. They made a feast and swore an oath to each other, and so they made peace. This covenant marked a turning point for Isaac. He realized that true success was not measured by wealth or material gain, but by the ability to live in peace with those around him, trusting God's provision and guidance. Isaac's decision to make peace with Abimelech was a reflection of his deepening faith and trust in God. He understood that God's promise was not just about land or descendants, but about being a vessel of peace and blessing to others. Isaac's actions mirrored the example set by his father Abraham, who had chosen peace over conflict and trust over self-reliance. Isaac's life became a testimony of how God's faithfulness can lead to peace even in the midst of adversity. By choosing to trust in God's timing and provision, Isaac was able to live in harmony with those around him, knowing that God's blessing would follow wherever he went.
Despite the peace Isaac had found and the blessings he had received, life continued to present challenges. The prosperity of the land and the well-being of his family were soon threatened by yet another trial. A severe famine struck the region. Crops failed once again, and the livestock suffered. People around Isaac, seeing their own struggles, began to leave for places with more resources, places where they hoped to find food and prosperity. Isaac was faced with a decision. Should he follow the crowd and leave the land God had promised him, or should he stay and trust that God would provide? The question gnawed at him, and for the first time in a long while, doubt began to creep into his heart. Could God really provide for him in the middle of such hardship? In the quiet moments of uncertainty, Isaac turned once more to God. He prayed fervently for guidance, asking whether he should leave the land or remain where God had directed him. The answer he received was clear and firm. "Stay in this land, and I will be with you. I will bless you and give this land to you and your descendants. I will fulfill the oath I swore to your father Abraham. I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed through them." Isaac, hearing these words from God, was reminded once again of the covenant that had been made with his father Abraham, a covenant that was now his to carry forward. Despite the famine and the difficulty that lay ahead, God had called him to remain, and Isaac knew he had no choice but to obey. It was a test of faith, just as it had been for his father Abraham. Now Isaac was asked to trust in God's provision and promises, even in the face of uncertainty. With renewed determination, Isaac decided to stay. He planted crops despite the dire conditions and trusted that God would provide. As he sowed his seeds in faith, Isaac was reminded that true prosperity does not come from human effort alone, but from God's blessings. And, indeed, as the months passed, God blessed Isaac's faithfulness. The crops flourished in the most unlikely of circumstances, and Isaac's fields began to yield more than enough to sustain his family and flocks. Isaac's success did not go unnoticed. The Philistines, who had once been envious of him, grew even more resentful of his prosperity. They began to fill in the wells that Abraham had dug, trying to take away the very lifeblood of Isaac's survival: water. This was not just an attempt to deprive him of resources, but a symbol of their desire to undermine his success. Instead of fighting back or growing angry, Isaac chose peace once again. Just as he had done before, he moved his camp to a new location, where he and his servants dug new wells. And once again, God provided water for them, and their lives continued to prosper. Isaac understood now that God's blessings were not simply about material wealth or physical sustenance. They were about the peace that came with trusting in God's provision. Every well Isaac dug, every challenge he faced, became an opportunity for him to reaffirm his trust in God. Isaac's life was becoming a living testament to the truth that those who trust in God's provision, no matter the circumstances, will find peace and fulfillment. When all the wells were dug and peace had once again been restored, God appeared to Isaac once more. This time, God spoke with reassurance. "I am the God of your father Abraham. Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." Isaac, deeply moved by God's faithfulness, built an altar to honor the Lord and worshiped him. It was a moment of profound gratitude, as Isaac realized that God's promises were not just for him, but for all the generations that would come after him. His faith had been tested, and through that testing, he had learned the true meaning of prosperity, not in material wealth, but in peace, trust, and obedience to God. As Isaac's faith continued to grow, his prosperity in the land began to spark envy once more, particularly among the Philistines. His herds had increased, his fields yielded abundant crops, and his wells provided water even during the time of famine. For a time, the Philistines had kept their distance, but as Isaac's influence expanded, their resentment grew. The jealousy that had been stirred earlier now became a full-blown conflict. The Philistine leaders, seeing the success and peace that Isaac had found, decided to act. They began to fill in the wells that Abraham had dug, denying Isaac access to one of the most crucial resources in that arid land. These actions were not just an attack on Isaac's livelihood, but also an attempt to break his spirit and challenge his claim to the land that God had promised. Isaac, however, had learned from his father's example. Abraham, when faced with similar challenges, had chosen the path of peace rather than conflict. Isaac could have reacted with anger, confronting the Philistines and demanding justice for the wells that had been filled. But instead, he chose to remain humble, trusting that God would guide him through the situation. Rather than retaliating, Isaac calmly moved his camp to another location. He instructed his servants to dig new wells, hoping to find water that would sustain his family and herds. The search for new wells was not easy, and the people around him mocked his efforts, but Isaac did not give up. His faith remained unshaken, and he continued to trust that God would provide. As they dug, Isaac's servants eventually discovered a well of fresh water. However, the Philistine herders once again came to dispute the well, claiming that it was theirs. Isaac could have fought for the well, but instead he chose to move once more, knowing that God had something better in store for him. Let there be no quarrel, God will provide. And so Isaac moved on. Isaac and his men traveled further, finding another location where they dug yet another well. Again, they were met with opposition from the Philistines. This time, however, Isaac's patience and trust began to bear fruit. Rather than engaging in more conflict, Isaac moved once again, choosing peace over confrontation. He understood that God's plan for him was greater than the temporary inconvenience of losing a well.
Finally, after much trial, Isaac and his servants dug another well, one that no one contested. It was a place of peace, where God had provided exactly what they needed. Isaac named this well Rehoboth, meaning room, saying, "Now the Lord has given us room, and we will flourish in the land." Isaac had learned the profound lesson that peace and obedience to God's will were more valuable than material success or victory in earthly disputes. By choosing to remain humble and trust in God's provision, Isaac had found a place of peace where his family and herds could thrive. Isaac's faith had been tested through the conflict with the Philistines, but instead of growing bitter or resentful, he had chosen humility, patience, and perseverance. As Isaac settled into his new home, God appeared to him once more, reaffirming the promise he had made to Abraham. "I am the God of your father Abraham," God said. "Do not be afraid, for I am with you. I will bless you and increase the number of your descendants for the sake of my servant Abraham." Isaac, filled with peace and gratitude, built an altar and called upon the name of the Lord. He knew that God was with him, just as he had been with his father, and that God's promises would continue to unfold. Isaac's faith and patience in the face of adversity continued to yield great fruit. As he settled into his new land, where God had provided room for him and his family to thrive, a sense of peace and stability filled his heart. His obedience to God's command to stay, despite the hardships, had brought blessings beyond measure. Yet, as with any period of prosperity, there were still those who would challenge his position. One day, after Isaac had found peace in his new location, King Abimelech of the Philistines, along with his chief advisor and commander of his army, came to visit him. They approached Isaac's camp, their faces serious but respectful. Isaac, who had once been driven out by this same king, now saw an opportunity to test the peace he had fought for.
He greeted them, but his voice carried a hint of suspicion. "Why have you come to me, seeing that you have been hostile to me and sent me away?" he asked. Abimelech, sensing Isaac's hesitation, responded with unexpected humility. "We saw clearly that the Lord is with you. We want to make a treaty with you, a covenant. Just as we did not harm you, but always treated you well and sent you away in peace, we ask now that you make a covenant with us." Isaac, who had experienced so much hardship and bitterness in his life, could have reacted with defensiveness or anger, but his journey of faith had taught him the importance of reconciliation and humility. Isaac knew that God had called him to a higher purpose than to hold grudges or foster hatred. The peace he had found through obedience to God was too valuable to squander on conflict.
"Why have you come to me now, after all that has happened between us?" Isaac asked again, but this time with a tone of openness. Abimelech answered, "We see that God is with you, and we want to ensure that there will be no conflict between us in the future. We want peace." Isaac, seeing the sincerity in Abimelech's words, agreed to the treaty. Together they made a covenant, swearing to live in peace and not harm one another. Isaac, in his wisdom, chose to follow the example of his father, Abraham, who had also made peace with the neighboring kings. Through this covenant, Isaac solidified his place in the land and proved that true strength comes not from power or might, but from the peace and trust in God's will. Isaac and Abimelech shared a meal together as part of the covenant, and Isaac gave thanks to God for bringing peace between them. Isaac knew that his success in life did not depend on his ability to fight or conquer, but on his willingness to walk in God's peace. This moment of reconciliation marked a turning point in Isaac's life, affirming his growing understanding that true blessing comes through humility, forgiveness, and faith. By choosing peace, Isaac had secured not only a prosperous future for his family, but also the favor of God in his life. As Isaac and his family continued to thrive in the land, the legacy of Abraham's faithfulness continued to unfold. Isaac understood now, more than ever, that the blessings of God were not just about material wealth, but about living a life of trust, obedience, and peace. As Isaac's life continued in peace and prosperity, he began to focus on the future, particularly on the generations that would come after him. The time was fast approaching when he would pass on the mantle of leadership and the promises of God to his sons Esau and Jacob. Although Isaac had witnessed God's faithfulness throughout his life, he knew that the legacy of faith could not simply be passed down through wealth or success, but through trust in God's will and guidance. Isaac, now an elderly man, called his sons to him. Esau, the eldest, had always been Isaac's favorite, a strong and capable man who had inherited much of his father's physical strength and tenacity. But Jacob was more contemplative and quiet, and though he had always been loved by Isaac, he had a certain complexity about him that made their relationship more difficult at times. But Isaac understood that God's promises were not based on human preferences or appearances. God's choice of the heir would not be determined by birthright alone. Just as God had chosen Abraham and had promised that his descendants would become a great nation, Isaac knew that the promise would extend through the son God chose, regardless of who was first born. It was time for Isaac to bless his sons. He called for Esau to come to him, asking him to prepare a meal of his favorite dish so that Isaac could bless him before he passed on. Esau, eager to receive his father's blessing, went out into the field to hunt as instructed.
Meanwhile, Rebekah, Isaac's wife, overheard the conversation. She knew that God had told her years before that the older son would serve the younger, and she was determined to ensure that Jacob, not Esau, would receive the blessing that was rightfully his. Rebekah devised a plan to deceive Isaac, convincing Jacob to pretend to be Esau and receive the blessing in his place. Jacob, though hesitant at first, was persuaded by his mother to follow through. He dressed in Esau's clothes, covered his hands and neck with goatskins to mimic his brother's hairy skin, and brought the meal to Isaac. Isaac, though blind in his old age, was suspicious at first, but he ate the food Jacob had prepared and then asked him to come closer. "Come near, my son, and let me feel you," Isaac said. "Are you really Esau, or are you Jacob?" Jacob, with a steady voice, answered, "I am Esau, your firstborn." Isaac, still uncertain, touched Jacob's hands and felt the goatskin. "The voice is Jacob's voice," Isaac said, "but the hands are the hands of Esau." Despite his doubts, Isaac blessed Jacob, believing him to be Esau. The blessing Isaac gave was the one that would secure Jacob's future. He said, "May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and those who bless you be blessed." Just as Isaac finished blessing Jacob, Esau returned, eager to receive his father's blessing. When Isaac realized that he had been deceived, his heart was filled with sorrow and regret. Esau begged for a blessing, but Isaac's words were already spoken, and there was no going back. Isaac, with deep sorrow, blessed Esau as well, but the blessing was not as great as the one given to Jacob. He said, "Your dwelling will be away from the earth's richness, away from the dew of heaven above. You will live by the sword, and you will serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you will throw his yoke from off your neck." Esau, devastated by the loss of the blessing, vowed to kill Jacob, but Rebekah, fearing for Jacob's life, sent him away to her brother Laban's house in Haran, urging him to stay there until Esau's anger subsided.
This moment marked the beginning of a new chapter in the lives of Isaac's sons. Jacob, though he had received the blessing through deceit, would now begin his journey to fulfill the promises God had made to Abraham. Esau, though left with a lesser blessing, would still find his place in God's plan, though his path would be marked by struggle. Isaac, despite the bitterness of the situation, knew that God's will would be done, and that the legacy of faith would continue through his sons, just as it had through him and his father. He trusted that God would guide them, even in their mistakes, and that his promises would remain true. Jacob, now the recipient of the blessing that was meant for Esau, left his father's house with a heavy heart. Though the blessing was his, it had come through deceit, and he knew that his actions had strained the relationship with his brother Esau. Jacob had not only deceived his father, but had also caused his brother great sorrow. As Jacob left, he carried with him the weight of his choices and the uncertainty of the future. Rebekah, his mother, had sent him away to her brother Laban's house in Haran, far from the land where Isaac and his family lived. She hoped that time would heal the rift between the brothers, but Jacob's path ahead was far from certain. As he traveled, Jacob carried with him not just the physical possessions of his journey, but the spiritual inheritance of his father's blessing. One night, while resting in an open field, Jacob laid his head upon a stone and fell into a deep sleep. As he slept, a remarkable vision came to him. In his dream, he saw a ladder that stretched from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending upon it. At the top of the ladder stood the Lord, who spoke to him in a voice filled with promise and authority. "I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac," God said. "I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." Jacob awoke from his dream with a sense of awe and wonder. He had seen a vision of God's promise, and he understood now more than ever that God's covenant with his family was alive and moving through him. Though he had acted in his own way to obtain the blessing, it was clear that God's plan for him was still unfolding. This vision was not just a dream, it was a confirmation that God had chosen him, and his promises would be fulfilled.
In that moment, Jacob took the stone he had used as a pillow and set it up as a pillar, pouring oil over it as a symbol of his commitment. He named the place Bethel, which means house of God, and made a vow, saying, "If God will be with me and will watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear so that I return safely to my father's house, then the Lord will be my God, and this stone that I have set up as a pillar will be God's house, and of all that you give me, I will give you a tenth." With this vow, Jacob committed himself fully to the God of his father and grandfather, understanding that God's covenant with his family would continue through him. He knew that the journey ahead would not be easy, but he trusted that God would be with him, guiding him through the challenges and leading him toward the fulfillment of his promises. As Jacob continued his journey to Haran, the vision of the ladder and the voice of God stayed with him. It was a reminder that despite his past actions, God's plans for him were greater than his mistakes. The road ahead would be long and filled with challenges, but Jacob was no longer walking alone. God was with him, and his promises would guide him every step of the way. Jacob's journey to Haran was long and uncertain. He traveled through the wilderness, carrying only his staff and the faith that had begun to grow within him after his encounter with God at Bethel. As he walked, he reflected on the vow he had made to God, knowing that his path ahead would be filled with challenges, but also with the promise of God's faithfulness. His heart was filled with both fear and hope, unsure of what the future held, but trusting that God would guide him. When Jacob finally arrived in Haran, he encountered a well where the shepherds gathered. He saw a young woman named Rachel, the daughter of his mother's brother, Laban. Rachel was beautiful, and Jacob was immediately struck by her presence. He learned that she was a shepherdess, and upon hearing that she was Laban's daughter, he felt a deep connection. In that moment, Jacob knew that his journey had led him to the right place. However, it was also clear to him that the road ahead would be marked by both blessings and struggles. Jacob, eager to win Rachel's heart, worked for Laban, her father, in exchange for the right to marry her. Laban agreed to give Rachel to Jacob in marriage if he worked for him for 7 years. Jacob, full of love and devotion, worked diligently for those 7 years, eager for the day when he could marry her. But the time passed quickly for Jacob, for his love for her was great. When the 7 years were completed, Jacob was excited to marry Rachel, but Laban deceived him. Instead of giving him Rachel, Laban tricked Jacob into marrying his older daughter, Leah. Jacob was shocked and dismayed, but Laban explained that it was not customary for the younger daughter to marry before the older one. Laban offered to give Rachel to Jacob as well if he agreed to work another 7 years. Jacob, although hurt and frustrated by Laban's deceit, agreed to the terms. His love for Rachel was so great that he was willing to work another 7 years in order to marry her. The bitterness of the situation was softened by the love he had for Rachel, and Jacob's perseverance in the face of deception marked a significant turning point in his life. Over time, Jacob's family grew. He had children with Leah and Rachel, and later with their maidservants, Zilpah and Bilhah.
But the rivalry between Leah and Rachel, each seeking Jacob's affection and favor, created tension in their home. Leah, who was not as loved by Jacob as Rachel, bore many children, while Rachel, who was loved more, struggled with infertility. Rachel's pain was deep, but she prayed earnestly to God for a child. Eventually, God answered her prayers, and she bore a son, Joseph, whom Jacob loved dearly. Jacob's family was growing, but so too were the tensions. As his sons grew older, jealousy and rivalry began to tear at the fabric of their relationships. The favoritism Jacob showed to Joseph, his beloved son by Rachel, sparked deep resentment among the other brothers. Jacob's actions, though born out of love for Joseph, created a divide among his sons that would soon have tragic consequences. Despite the challenges Jacob faced, God's promises to him continued to unfold. God blessed him with many children, and his family began to grow into a nation, just as he had promised at Bethel. But Jacob was not yet the man he would become. He still had much to learn about humility, forgiveness, and the importance of trusting in God's timing. One night, as Jacob's family continued to grow and his struggles deepened, God spoke to him again. "Jacob, return to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you." It was a clear command, and Jacob knew that it was time to return to the land God had promised to him and his descendants. After many years of struggle, family conflict, and personal growth, Jacob finally set out to return to the land promised to him and his ancestors. God had spoken to him in the night, calling him back to Canaan, the land where Abraham and Isaac had once lived in faith. Jacob, now a man transformed by the experiences of his life, gathered his family and possessions and began the journey back to Canaan. The road ahead was fraught with tension. Jacob knew that his brother Esau, whom he had deceived many years ago, still harbored a deep anger toward him. The last time they had met, Esau had vowed to kill Jacob for stealing his blessing. Now, as Jacob prepared to return home, he feared the confrontation that might await him.
At that moment, Jacob received a new identity. No longer would he be known as the deceiver, the one who had stolen his brother's birthright. He was now Israel, one who wrestles with God and prevails. God blessed him there, and Jacob, now a new man, understood that the struggle had not just been with the mysterious figure, but with his own past, his own fears, and his own weaknesses. Jacob, now Israel, limped away from that encounter, but he carried with him a newfound strength, a strength that came from his encounter with God. It was an encounter that transformed him completely from the inside out. The next day, when Esau came to meet him, Jacob approached with humility, bowing to the ground 7 times as a sign of respect and repentance. But Esau, seeing his brother's sincere remorse and seeing the gifts Jacob had sent, ran to him, embraced him, and kissed him. The two brothers, who had once been torn apart by deception and hatred, were now reconciled. God had answered Jacob's prayer, bringing peace where there had been fear and division. Jacob and Esau, though different in their paths, had been united by the grace of God. Jacob, now Israel, knew that God's promises were true, not just for his father and grandfather, but for him as well. God had been faithful to him, and he had learned that the true blessing was not in wealth or power, but in reconciliation, trust, and faith in God's plan. As Jacob settled back in the land, he knew that his journey was far from over, but he had seen the fulfillment of God's promises in a new way. That God, though he may test and challenge us, is always with us, guiding us toward peace, reconciliation, and a deeper relationship with him. Did you like the video? Don't forget to leave your like and share it with your friends.
Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any exciting stories, and activate the bell to receive notifications firsthand. And we want to know your opinion. Comment below what you thought of this video and share your thoughts with us. Let's be part of this journey of faith and learning together.
Before continuing his journey, Jacob sent messengers ahead to Esau, hoping to pacify his brother and seek reconciliation. He offered gifts, many flocks of sheep, goats, and camels, as a way to soften Esau's heart. Jacob's hope was that these gifts would convey his remorse for the pain he had caused and show his desire to make peace. But the messengers returned with troubling news. Esau was coming to meet him with 400 men. Fear gripped Jacob's heart. The possibility of conflict loomed large, and he did not know if his brother was still intent on revenge. In this moment of uncertainty, Jacob turned to God in prayer. "O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac," Jacob prayed, "you who said to me, 'Go back to your country and your relatives, and I will make you prosper.' I am unworthy of all the kindness and faithfulness you have shown your servant. Save me from the hand of my brother Esau, for I am afraid he will come and attack me, and also the mothers with their children." Jacob acknowledged his unworthiness and his fear, but he also trusted in the God who had promised to be with him. He had seen God's faithfulness through the years, and now he had to trust that the same God would protect him and his family in this moment of crisis. That night, after his prayer, Jacob sent his family and possessions across the river to safety. He remained alone on the other side, wrestling with his thoughts and fears. It was there, in the stillness of the night, that he encountered a mysterious figure. The figure appeared out of nowhere, and they began to wrestle, struggling through the night. Jacob, despite his fear and exhaustion, fought fiercely, unwilling to let go. As dawn broke, the figure touched Jacob's hip and dislocated it. Yet, despite the pain, Jacob held on. "I will not let you go unless you bless me," he said, his grip firm. The figure, who revealed himself to be God, asked, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he replied. Then God said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome."